look at why solar adoption in rural Indonesia actually dropped by 26%, even as the technology got cheaper, and ask what that tells us about the limits of tech-first thinking and energy transitions. Plus, precision agriculture, innovation networks, indigenous planning policy, and women-led rural development in South America. Stay with us. I'm Art.
I'm Jan.
And this is the Rural Innovator, a weekly look at the research, news, and projects shaping rural innovation, drawn from the library at ruralinnovations.org.
Let's start with the research this week. We've got 3 articles in the library, and I want to begin with the one on precision agriculture, the review published in the journal Agriculture from 2023.
Right. Before we get into the methodology, who's this written for? Is this a practitioner-facing piece, or is it more of an academic literature survey?
It's a review article, so it's synthesizing recent innovation in what the authors call smart farming, pulling together work on IoT sensors, drone applications, machine learning, and remote sensing. It's not reporting original field data. It's mapping the landscape of where the field is.
Okay, and what's the core argument?
The core argument is that precision agriculture has real potential to boost crop yields while reducing environmental damage. Less water, less fertilizer, less pesticide waste. But the authors are pretty candid that the technology has outpaced adoption. There are 2 main barriers they keep returning to.
Which are?
First, data management. These systems generate enormous volumes of data, from soil sensors, satellite imagery, drone passes. And most farms, especially smaller operations, don't have the infrastructure or the expertise to make sense of it. Second, farmer adoption. The gap between what the technology can do in a trial setting and what actually gets used on working farms is still very wide.
That second one doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, we've been talking about precision agriculture for, 25 years now? The adoption curve has always lagged behind the capability curve, and I think there's a structural reason for that.
Go on.
The technology is often developed and demonstrated on large, well-capitalized operations. Big grain farms in the American Midwest, or in Saskatchewan, Saskatoon, the broader province, where you've got the scale to justify the investment. And then we're surprised it doesn't transfer smoothly to a 200-acre mixed farm in a lower-income region.
That's fair. The review does acknowledge that cost and scale are factors, though I'd push back slightly on the framing that this is only a capital problem. Some of the barriers are genuinely technical. Interoperability between systems, connectivity in remote areas, the absence of local technical support.
Sure, those are real, but connectivity and local support are also downstream of investment decisions, right? If rural infrastructure had received the same capital attention as urban infrastructure over the last 2 decades, some of those technical barriers look different.
I don't disagree with that. What I'd add is that the review also flags something less discussed, the environmental monitoring dimension. These technologies aren't just about yield. They're generating data on soil health, water usage, carbon dynamics, and that data has value beyond the individual farm.
Which opens up questions about who owns it. The farmer who generated it, the platform that processed it, the public if it has environmental relevance.
Exactly. The review doesn't resolve that. It surfaces it as an open question, which I think is the right call for a literature survey. But it's one of those issues where the policy debate is genuinely behind the technology.
All right, what would you tell someone in extension services? Someone working with farmers on the ground? What's the takeaway from this piece?
I'd say, don't lead with the technology. The review implicitly suggests that the adoption problem is at least partly a trust and translation problem. Farmers need local demonstrations, peer networks, and practical support, not just access to another app or sensor system.
That maps onto a lot of what we hear from ag extension programs. The trusted local intermediary is still the most powerful adoption lever we've got. Okay, second article.
Second article is older. It's Bert's longitudinal study on collaboration networks, structural holes, and innovation, published in the journal Administrative Science Quarterly. This one's a classic in the innovation networks literature.
Walk me through it. Because I know the term structural holes gets used a lot, but I'm not sure everyone has the same definition in mind.
Right, so a structural hole is a gap in a network. Imagine you work with partner A and partner B, but A and B don't work with each other. You sit between them, you're the bridge. That's a structural hole. And in some contexts, the person who bridges it gains a strategic advantage. They control information flow.
So traditionally, that's been seen as a good thing. You're the connector. You have brokerage power.
In individual careers, yes, that's Bert's earlier work. But in this longitudinal study of chemical industry firms, the finding is more nuanced. For firms collaborating on innovation, structural holes in their networks actually reduce innovation output.
That's counterintuitive. Why?
Because inter-firm innovation depends on knowledge recombination. When your partners are also connected to each other, information circulates more richly. You get redundancy, but you also get trust, shared norms, and the ability to build on each other's work. When there are holes, you lose that density.
So the brokerage advantage that helps an individual career actually works against collective innovation.
That's the core finding, yes. And the study supports it longitudinally. It's not a snapshot. They're tracking firms over time, which gives the causal argument more credibility than a lot of network studies.
What's the sample? Because chemical industry firms in, I'm guessing, a fairly specific context, I want to know how far we can extend this.
It is a specific sector, and Bert's own framing is careful about that. The study is grounded in large industrial firms, so applying it directly to, say, a rural small business innovation network requires some caution.
That's where I was going. Because in a rural context, structural holes are often just geographic reality. Your partners don't know each other because they're 200 kilometers apart and nobody's had the time or money to build those bridges. It's not a strategic choice. It's a resource constraint.
That's a genuinely important distinction, and I think the practical implication flips a bit in that context. Instead of saying close the structural holes, you might say invest in the infrastructure that allows those connections to form in the first place. Regional innovation hubs, shared platforms, cooperative networks.
Which is exactly the policy argument for rural innovation intermediaries. They're not just nice to have. They're doing structural work that the market won't do on its own.
Right? And it's worth noting that both direct and indirect business relationships in the study boosted innovation output. So even weak or mediated ties have value. That's encouraging for rural contexts where you can't always build strong direct relationships across distance.
Okay, third article, and this one's a bit different.
It is. This is a Master of Resource Management project from Simon Fraser University. So graduate level, applied research. The focus is on Indigenous cultural heritage policies and how they intersect with local planning practice. It uses a place-based case study in an area described as the Land of Plenty.
Right. And before we get into what they found, why does this belong in the Rural Innovation Library? I think some listeners might not immediately make that connection.
That's a fair question to raise. The connection is that rural innovation doesn't happen in a policy vacuum. In a lot of rural communities across Canada and many other countries, Indigenous land rights, cultural heritage designations, and planning processes are deeply entangled. If you're working on a rural development project, whether that's energy infrastructure, agricultural land use, or a tech hub, you're operating within that landscape.
And the argument of this project is that there are implementation gaps, that the policies exist on paper but don't translate well into local planning decisions.
That's right. The research surfaces those gaps between what Indigenous cultural heritage policies say and what actually happens when planners and municipalities apply them. The case study approach means it's place-specific, so we can't generalize too broadly. But the patterns it identifies are consistent with what other researchers have found in this space.
What kinds of gaps are we talking about?
The summary we have is a bit truncated, so I want to be careful not to overread it. But the framing suggests gaps in how policies are implemented at the local planning level, which implies discretion being exercised in ways that don't fully honor the intent of the policies, and possibilities too, ways those gaps could be closed.
That word possibilities is doing a lot of work. I think what I'd want to know from the full project is whether those possibilities are already happening somewhere. Is there a jurisdiction that's doing this well? Because that's where the practical learning lives.
That's exactly the question a practitioner would ask. And it's a case study limitation. The scope is one place, one planning context. What it does well is go deep. The implementation gap is documented carefully. The broader comparative question is for future work.
Fair enough. And for anyone working in rural planning in Canada, or anywhere with overlapping Indigenous jurisdiction, this is worth reading. The full project is available through SFU's Summit repository.
Links in the library at ruralinnovations.org as always. Okay, let's move to the news and development segment.
We've got a lot this week. Spain, South Africa, Uganda, Indonesia, and a piece from the FAO on gender transformation in South America.
Let's start with Spain. This one's genuinely interesting as a policy model. Spain has been celebrating 10 years of what they call operational groups, collaborative networks that bring together farmers, researchers, businesses, and advisors to tackle specific agricultural challenges.
And they've been running through the European Innovation Partnership for Agriculture, right? This isn't a purely national program.
Correct, the EIP Agri framework. Spain leads the EU in the number of operational groups, which is a significant achievement given the competition. At the 10-year mark, they showcased 5 groups as case studies.
And the range of what those groups are working on is striking. Digital tomato cultivation, sustainable olive farming, wine bottle recycling, carbon sequestration in livestock. That's not a narrow research agenda.
What's interesting to me about the model is its structure. These aren't top-down programs where the government decides what farmers should work on. The groups form around problems that practitioners have identified. The research follows the need.
Which is what good extension should look like. And the 10-year horizon matters. It suggests this isn't a pilot that got cut after 2 funding cycles. There's institutional commitment there.
The longevity point is important. A lot of rural innovation programming in other countries doesn't survive past the initial grant period. The question is always what the sustainability model looks like after the public funding tapers.
Do we know anything about that from the Spain piece?
The coverage is more celebratory than analytical on that question. It's announcing the anniversary. But Spain's leadership in the EU context suggests there's a policy environment that keeps it going. CAP funding, regional agricultural policy, ministerial support.
Which is a very different policy context from, say, Canada, where agricultural innovation programming tends to be more fragmented across federal and provincial lines.
That's a real structural difference. All right, South Africa. This one's about funding for township and rural startups.
More than 760 million rand since 2015. That's a substantial number.
It is. Dispersed through the Small Business Development Ministry and channeled through the Small Enterprise Development and Finance Agency, SEDA, and related institutions. The focus is on digital skills training, innovation funding, and economic transformation programs, specifically targeting township and rural entrepreneurs.
What I find interesting here is the deliberate targeting. It's not just small business support. It's explicitly directing capital toward historically marginalized geographies. That's a policy choice that a lot of governments talk about, but don't always follow through on.
Right. The question I'd want answered, and this news item doesn't quite get there, is what the outcomes look like. 760 million rand over a decade is the input. What's the output in terms of business survival rates, employment, economic diversification in the target communities?
That's a fair ask. And I'll say from a rural development perspective, capital access is necessary but not sufficient. You also need markets, infrastructure, skills, and networks, which brings us back to the structural holes conversation from the research segment.
That's a nice thread to pull on. If the startups being funded are operating in isolation, without connections to each other, to urban markets, to knowledge networks, then the capital alone won't produce the innovation outcomes you'd hope for.
Exactly. The money's necessary. The network architecture around it matters just as much.
Uganda is next. The African Development Bank approved nearly 104 million euros for Phase II of Uganda's Rural Electricity Access Project, UREAP, and a separate tranche of just over 7 million euros to complete compensation payments for communities affected by Phase I.
Let's start with that second piece, the compensation payments, because that detail is easy to gloss over, but it's actually pretty important.
It is. When large infrastructure projects happen in rural areas, grid expansion, road building, whatever it is, communities are often affected in ways that aren't fully accounted for upfront. People lose land access. Livelihoods are disrupted. The fact that Phase II approval came alongside a specific tranche to complete those outstanding obligations, that's a governance signal.
It suggests accountability mechanisms are working, at least partially, which isn't always the case in development-financed infrastructure.
Agreed. And the Phase I numbers are significant. 137,770 households connected to the grid. In a country where rural electrification rates have historically been very low, that's transformative access.
Phase II would expand that further, and the last mile framing is key. This is about reaching the households that commercial utilities have no financial incentive to connect.
Which is the structural market failure that development finance is supposed to address. The question is always whether the infrastructure, once built, is supported by the operational and maintenance capacity to keep it running.
And that's a thread that connects directly to the Indonesia story. Let's get to that one.
The Indonesia piece is from Mongubay, and it's really striking. Solar adoption in rural Indonesia dropped 26% between 2021 and 2024, despite the fact that solar technology got cheaper over that same period.
So cheaper technology, less adoption. That's the opposite of what economic theory would predict.
Right? And the report identifies 3 main barriers. First, fossil fuel subsidies. The Indonesian government subsidizes conventional energy, which artificially suppresses the relative price advantage of solar. Second, high installation and upfront costs, even if the technology itself is cheaper. Third, maintenance challenges in remote areas, particularly in eastern Indonesia.
The maintenance piece is underappreciated in a lot of these conversations. You can give someone a solar panel. What happens when it breaks 3 years later and there's no one within 200 kilometers who knows how to fix it?
That's exactly what the report surfaces. And 84,000 villages is the scale we're talking about in Indonesia. The geographic and logistical complexity of building a maintenance and support network across that landscape is genuinely enormous.
And the fossil fuel subsidy piece is a policy problem, not a technology problem. No amount of solar innovation solves that. You need political will to reform the subsidy structure.
I'd add that subsidies are politically sticky for a reason. Rural households in lower income regions are often the direct beneficiaries of cheap fossil fuel. Removing those subsidies without a transition plan hits the most vulnerable people hardest. It's not a simple policy lever.
Fair. That's a real tension. Okay, last news item. The FAO piece on women-led rural development in Brazil and Uruguay.
This one I find genuinely hopeful. And that's not always the word I'd use for development reporting. The study examines women-led initiatives supported by IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, in both countries. The approach is agroecological and inclusive, deliberately using minimal external resource.
And the outcomes?
Transformative results by the study's own framing, strengthened local policies, economic growth in the target communities, and women becoming catalysts for broader community change, not just beneficiaries of a program.
That distinction matters. There's a big difference between a program that helps women and a program that empowers women as development actors in their own communities.
Right. And the agroecological angle is interesting. These aren't high-tech interventions. They're working with local knowledge, local ecosystems, and local production methods, which connects back to the precision agriculture conversation in an interesting way.
How so?
Well, precision ag assumes a fairly capital-intensive, technology-heavy path to agricultural improvement. The Brazil and Uruguay case suggests there are other paths, ones that start with community knowledge and social organization, rather than sensors and machine learning.
I'd say those aren't mutually exclusive. The question is sequencing and context. In a community with deep local agroecological knowledge and no capital, you build on what's there. In a large-scale grain operation with capital access, the technology path makes sense.
Agreed. What the FAO piece challenges is the assumption that rural agricultural improvement always looks like adding technology. Sometimes it looks like removing barriers to women's leadership and letting local knowledge do its work.
That's a real lesson. Okay, let's move to organizations and events.
This week, the library added a few items worth flagging. On the organization side, Spain's Operational Groups Network, the Red PAC, Red PHGUS, is worth knowing about if you're working in European agricultural innovation policy. Their work is documented at the link we'll post, and their project archive is a useful model for what collaborative research practice partnerships can look like at scale.
I'd add that even if you're not in Europe, the operational groups model is worth studying as a design template. The question of how you structure a network that brings together farmers, researchers, and businesses around a shared problem? That's not a European-only question.
Completely right. The South Africa item also points to an organization worth knowing, SEDA, the Small Enterprise Development and Finance Agency. If you're working in African rural development or studying how development finance reaches small enterprises, their programming is worth tracking.
And the African Development Bank more broadly. Their rural electrification portfolio is one of the more substantial bodies of work on last-mile infrastructure finance anywhere in the world. The Uganda UREAP documentation is worth reading in full if you're working on rural energy access.
On the events side, we don't have specific events to flag from this week's library editions, but I'd note that the FAO's agroecology work, including the Brazil-Uruguay study, connects to a broader community of practice around agroecological transitions. The FAO agroecology pages are a good entry point if you want to find conferences and networks in that space.
And for anyone working in precision agriculture, the research article we covered is from the journal Agriculture, which is an open-access MDPI publication. The broader journal is worth following if you're tracking technology innovation in farming. Lots of review articles that map the state of play across specific tech domains.
All links, as always, at ruralinnovations.org. Let's get into the closing thoughts.
So here's the pattern I keep coming back to this week. We have a precision agriculture review that says technology is there, but adoption lags. We have an Indonesia story that says solar got cheaper, but uptake dropped. We have a network study that says connections between partners matter as much as the innovation itself. And we have a Brazil-Uruguay study that says women with local knowledge, minimal resources, and community trust drove transformative change.
The thread I'd pull is this. There's a persistent assumption in rural innovation policy that the binding constraint is the technology. Get the technology right, get it cheaper, get it deployed, and outcomes follow. What this week's library is collectively pushing back on is that assumption.
And I think that's right. But I want to be careful not to swing too far the other way. Technology does matter. The precision AG tools are real, and they do improve yields. The solar panels work. The grid connections in Uganda are genuinely life-changing for those 137,000 households.
Agreed. I'm not arguing for a technology skeptic position. What I'm arguing is that the technology is the easy part, or at least the part we know how to do. The hard part is the social, institutional, and network infrastructure around it.
The Bird article is useful here, because what it's really saying is that the structure of relationships in an innovation network shapes what the network can produce. Not just who's in the network, but how they're connected.
And rural contexts are often structurally disadvantaged on exactly that dimension. Not because rural people are less capable of innovation, that's a myth worth naming, but because geography, history, and underfunding have produced networks with more holes than they should have.
So when Spain invests in operational groups over a decade, what they're really doing is structural network investment. They're closing holes. They're building the dense, trust-based connections that the BERT study says you need for collaborative innovation.
That's a generous reading of the Spain model, and I think it's largely right. Though I'd note that 10 years is still a short timeline for the kind of deep institutional trust that produces durable innovation ecosystems.
20 years then, or 30. The point is that it takes longer than a 4-year funding cycle, which is the planning horizon most governments actually operate on.
That's the structural mismatch at the heart of a lot of rural innovation policy. The timelines for trust building and network development are generational. The timelines for political accountability are electoral.
And the Indonesia story is a sharp illustration of how political timelines create perverse outcomes. Fossil fuel subsidies persist because they're politically useful in the short term, but they structurally disadvantage the energy transition over the medium and long term, especially in rural areas.
The Brazil and Uruguay case is interesting in that context too, because what IFAD was doing there was investing in exactly the slow-building, trust-based, community-grounded work that doesn't fit neatly into a program evaluation cycle. And the outcomes were transformative.
So how do you sell that to a ministry that wants to show results in 18 months?
Honestly, I think you show the 18-month results. There are early indicators. Women are leading, local policies are shifting, production is changing. But you're honest that the deeper transformation takes longer, and you build in the monitoring systems to capture it.
And you tell the story well. The Spain anniversary piece is partly about telling that long story in a way that builds political legitimacy for continued investment.
That's actually underrated as a function of rural innovation work. Narrative. The story about what's happening in rural places, told in ways that people with decision-making power can receive. Innovation isn't just a metropolitan story, as the saying goes.
Right. And the Indigenous planning piece fits here too. Because one of the things that implementation gap research does is make visible the work that's not being done, the policies that exist on paper but haven't been honored in practice. That visibility is a precondition for change.
Documentation as a form of advocacy. Yes. The gap between policy intent and planning practice doesn't close on its own. Someone has to name it, measure it, and bring it to the table.
So if I were to distill this week's library into a single uncomfortable question, it would be this. Are we building rural innovation policy around the constraints that are easy to measure, like technology availability and capital deployed, and ignoring the constraints that are harder to measure, like network density, trust, institutional commitment, and who's actually at the decision-making table?
That's the question, and I think the honest answer, from this week's evidence, is yes, mostly. The measurement problem is real. You can count solar panels deployed. It's harder to count the maintenance networks that don't exist, or the trust that hasn't been built, or the Indigenous planning policies that haven't been honored.
But the harder to measure things are often the binding constraints.
That's the argument. And it's one this library keeps making, week after week, from a lot of different directions.
Which is probably why it takes a whole library to make it.
That's the week. The full library, every article we discussed, and the newsletter that started this whole conversation are at ruralinnovations.org.
See you next Friday.